Well, Italy could have an election as early as February. Interior Minister Angelino Alfano made the remark after speaking with outgoing Prime Minister Matteo Renzi. Renzi announced his resignation after a resounding referendum defeat this week on the country's constitution. But President Sergio Mattarella told him to stay on until Parliament approves the 2017 budget. My colleague Daniel Rentjes spoke to Ben Margulies. He's a research fellow in the Politics and International Studies Department at Warwick University in the UK. He began by asking what's next for Italy and its political limbo.
It's difficult to tell exactly what message Italy's voters have sent because in reality, their no vote is split among several different camps. Quite a few people opposed the reforms because they felt the reforms were bad, that they concentrated too much power in the prime minister, that populists could get hold of this power. So some of them were voting on the subject at hand. Some of them were voting because they, in fact, support the populist and dislike the elite, and some of them were simply, as in most referendums, voting no because they opposed the government in office. So there were a variety of messages being sent. Probably the clearest one is that a sense of discontent with Prime Minister Renzi, who formally resigned earlier today. As for what happens next, nothing too alarming. What seems to be happening is that Renzi will stay in office for a few more days to pass the next budget, and then the Italian president, Sergio Mattarella, will appoint a caretaker or interim prime minister, perhaps the current finance minister, to draft a new electoral law and run the country until the next elections, which will probably be in the beginning of 2018, maybe slightly earlier. So it's probably just going to be, Italy will tick on as usual, at least in terms of how its government functions for the next year. And these sorts of interim technical governments are actually quite common in Italy.
And I just wanted to ask you about Austria. There was a bit of a sigh of relief from the establishment when the president there, the election there, the far-right candidate has not been elected in by not very much of a margin, though. So what does this tell us about where Europe is at the moment?
It's difficult to say whether Austria itself is representative of Europe because it's small. The presidential election, the president is mostly symbolic. That makes it easier to vote for the far right because there's less at stake. And because the far right has been strong in Austria for a long time. What I think the signal is that as much as this is a sigh of relief, the fact of the matter remains that the populists, that right-wing populism is a strong force in Europe, that if you break voters down into a two-choice election, it can easily win 40% or more of the vote. And it's striking that Norbert Hofer, who was the far-right candidate, won about the same proportion of the vote in Austria as Donald Trump won last month in the United States, which is about 46%. So, again, it's worth a sigh of relief, but it definitely shows that right-wing populism has a significant support base and an ability to rally large, near-majority groups of voters in certain situations.
And talking of right-wing populists, there seems to be some degree of fertile ground both in France and Germany for these kind of candidates, and both elections are coming up. Do you think we'll see a much more right-wing Europe going forward with these two major countries?
I think we are definitely looking, I think in France it's quite likely that the next president will be of some sort of right-winger. It's more likely to be François Fillon, who's the establishment conservative candidate, but even he is on the right of his, of the mainstream right, and that's important because it'll keep middle-class conservative voters defecting to the more populist Marine Le Pen. So France definitely looks like it's heading to the right, if in a more conventional sense than if it were to vote for Marine Le Pen, which is still fairly unlikely. Germany is slightly different in that the far right is much more recent. The far right party emerged much more recently. Germany's history creates a larger barrier to voting for it. Germany is more economically successful than France. I think what's most likely to happen in Germany when they vote in the autumn of 2017 is that you'll see Merkel win a plurality, and she'll form some sort of coalition. What you tend to see in Germany, and you see this a lot in the state elections the last couple of years, is that the right populists will do well, and the mainstream parties will have to go to all sorts of weird coalitions, red, black, green, red, yellow, green, so on, to keep the right populists out. And that actually helps them in the long run because it makes all the mainstream parties look like they're all the same and ganging together. So the right populists, there is definitely fertile ground in Germany, probably less than there is in France. But definitely both countries will be moving to the right.